Hello, everybody. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and the custodians of the land on which we meet today, Mianjin. And I would like to emphasize that this land was never ceded, but rather taken. On behalf of everyone here and the institution for which I work, the University of Queensland, I would like to pay respect to the Turrbal and Jagera peoples, their ancestors and their descendants, and their enduring cultural and spiritual connections to country. We stand with them in solidarity and acknowledge the complicity of institutions like the university in ongoing processes of dispossession. I'd also like to extend that collective acknowledgement and solidarity to the traditional owners and custodians of the various lands from which you join us today, and to the Quanang-speaking peoples in whose homelands the University of Victoria and the Polis Project are located, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasainak peoples whose relationships with those lands and waters continue to this day. Welcome to the first lecture in the 2024 People, Plants and the Law online lecture series. One of the aims of the series is to bring together personal historical reflections from a group of the most important figures working on people, plants and the law over the last 40 years. Another aim is to showcase some of the best work happening currently in the area. We've been running for 3 years now, and you can find the recordings of previous year's lectures along with recordings of this year's lectures on the series website. If you have any questions for our speaker, please post them in the comments section and we'll do our best to get to some of them after the talk. In today's lecture, we're showcasing some of the most exciting work currently being undertaken from one of the longest standing scholars working in the area. Our speaker today is Dr. Kelly Bannister, co-director of the Polis Project on Ecological Governance within the Centre for Global Studies at the University of Victoria in Canada. At the turn of the century, Dr. Bannister was working to develop standards on Indigenous research and health ethics with Canada's peak research and research funding bodies. She also played a key role in the adoption of the International Society of Ethnobiology's incredibly influential Code of Ethics, completed in 2006. Since then, she has done a great deal of the intellectual work of unpacking the variegation, multiplicity, and of course diversity, which stand behind what have sometimes been represented as singularizing moments, the adoption of codes, guidelines, or standards, and the codification of the moral ideas which sit beneath them. It's nigh on impossible to encapsulate such a large and illustrious body of work in a few short sentences. But there are two themes that I would like to call attention to in framing today's talk. Firstly, there's an openness to pluralism in Dr. Bannister's work, and I think the generosity that's necessary to maintain such a position, to reach out away from the individual to collectives and groups, and away from the human-centric to the relational and environmental. That openness to pluralism and generosity flow through Dr. Bannister's work across the Polis Project's current initiatives on water sustainability, wildfire resilience, and biocultural ethics, and into today's paper, which brings diversity explicitly into focus. Secondly, there is a long-standing commitment in Dr. Bannister's work to understanding what it means when there are many, how relationships and interrelationships, right relationships, can be formed for getting along and working across different legal, ethical, and epistemological systems. It's a great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Bannister, who will be speaking today on people-plant interrelationships and the law, but whose law? Expanding the conversation through ethnobiology and biocultural ethics. Thank you, Dr. Bannister.
Oh, thank you so much, Barris, for your kind introduction and also for all your support and your enthusiasm about this um, this online series so that we could come together across all of our diversities and spend a little time together, hopefully for some interesting conversation and maybe some convergences. And I guess my hope is to inspire a little bit of new ways of thinking or sensing into what's needed in this very challenging time that we live. I am joining this session from my home. I'm not at the university right now, so I'm at my home in Coast Salish territory, which is about 100 kilometers north of where the University of Victoria is located. And I'm just going to screen share as I start to talk, just locate myself. There, okay. Thank you for acknowledging the Lekwungen speaking peoples, today known as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations, as well as the neighboring Wasanich Nations, where the University of Victoria is. I am on the unceded lands and waters of the Halkominum speaking Penelakut tribe, which is also Coast Salish nations. And I would like to self-locate as an English-speaking and non-Indigenous fourth-generation settler in Canada of Ukrainian and British ancestry. I live on a tiny little island, and I've tried to locate it for you. It's about 13,000 kilometers away from, if you're in Australia, away from you. And I'm on the southwest part of Canada, just above the USA. And I'm on a tiny little island. There's a big island you can see on the left image, and on the right there's the big island, and there's a whole bunch of tiny little islands. So I'm there in the Penelakut territory on a place called Fetus Island with neighboring Penelakut Island. And so in the spirit of diversity, I want to, which is a key theme of my talk, I want to take a moment to just invite you to the west coast of British Columbia, where I'm located. Because BC, as we call British Columbia, is home to the highest biological, cultural, and linguistic diversity of any province in Canada. And in BC, there's 7 distinct language families that are completely unrelated to each other. And within these families, there are 34 different First Nations languages and at least 93 different dialects of those languages. And Indigenous languages in BC make up over 50% of the 61 languages that are Indigenous in Canada. So we have very high diversity in all ways in this place that I live, which is probably why I've developed such a appreciation for the importance of diversity across many different realms. In BC's languages, all are critically endangered with less than 1,000 fluent speakers. Many have less than 50, and some have less than a handful. But there's been tremendous language revitalization efforts underway in BC, and many languages are starting to show increases in speakers. And so I want to pause, and I want to see if anybody's wondering, why am I talking about languages when this is supposed to be a talk about people, plants, and the law? Well, I'm glad you asked. In part because I was kind of taken by the title of your series, to be honest. Taken by surprise and also a bit curious as to why plants is the only thing that's pluralized. People and the law are singular. And so, yeah, I was just curious about that and wondering, is it because only one legal tradition seems relevant to people and plants? And if that's the case, I guess I'm hoping I'll provoke some other ways of thinking and widen that process of thought. So that's a question I hold, and maybe we'll discuss, or maybe not. Maybe we'll discuss in future if I am successful in provoking something useful in your thoughts. So I guess that's the goal for my talk. And secondly, the lack of plurality in and an emphasis on the law also feels like an invitation or responsibility that I really can't ignore as somebody working with biological and cultural diversity and situating my work in relational ethics, all of which I believe are relevant to a diversity and plurality of legal traditions. But before I go on, I just want to make clear that I'm not trained in law in any way. I don't have any formal training as a scholar or practitioner. I just have a tremendous, long standing interests. I collaborate with legal scholars and practitioners. And I think that it's been a very important cousin to the work in ethics that I do. So I may use terms that you don't use in the same way. I hope that you'll hold that lightly if that's the case across our countries and across our different disciplinary backgrounds. But hopefully we can still understand one another well enough. Inspired by the lack of plurality in this series title, I decided to open this first talk of this series with an exploration of some diversities that feel particularly relevant to my work and also to the series theme, one being language and the other being law. So I'll talk about those a little bit before I move on to talk about my work in ethics, because they're highly relevant. And in fact, I think in a way, they're learning about diversity in language and laws underpins what's needed in the realm of ethics today. And one of the reasons I bring up language is that in Canada, Indigenous languages are tied to the land, often described as of the land, as each Indigenous language is uniquely shaped by the lands and waters that it comes from, encoding historical, ecological, cultural, and other kinds of information about those lands and waters that's not held anywhere else. And in Canada, we understand Indigenous languages and knowledge as place-based, but those of us who work in broader policy or legal contexts within Western institutions often need reminders that if we extrapolate or generalize from one place or people to another, then we create distortions and misunderstandings, and these can create harms. And Canada, I'll only speak for my country, I know there's others. Canada has a shameful legacy of unforgivable harms done to Indigenous peoples through oppressive government policies and residential schools and medical atrocities, including intentional but thankfully not successful attempts to extinguish Indigenous languages. And typically it would be my preference to invite an Indigenous colleague to co-present with me in a forum like this, but circumstances didn't permit. So I've indirectly invited a mentor and friend and collaborator to stand with me today. This is a person I'm pleased to introduce you to indirectly, Dr. Elmer Ghostkeeper, who's a Métis elder from the Buffalo Lake Métis settlement in the province of Alberta. And he's a fluent speaker of Michif and Bushland Cree languages, so 2 Indigenous languages. And Elmer's worked with me in applied ethics for several years, and he's been pivotal in helping me understand the relevance of language to, I would say, everything, including people, plants, and the law. So I'm sharing a little bit of about that with you today. And he's also helped me realize, he didn't tell me this, but I've realized this, how impossible it is for me as a non-Indigenous Western trained scientist. You can substitute lawyer or legal scholar if that's what you are, to truly understand Indigenous teachings. And I work hard over decades to glimpse the essence, and I do find ways to deeply relate. But try as I do, I know I won't really get it because there's so much lost on me coming from a different language, a different worldview, and a different value system. And there is a high chance I will, with all good intentions, misrepresent because my attunement is different. I know how I relate is different. But I think something I do understand from all this is that I always need to be aware and humble about the fact that I don't fully understand, and not mistake what I do understand for the full picture. So Elmer has explained that Indigenous oral languages are made up of sounds, and these sounds come from the land, and this language of the land conveys the teachings of the land. This is a theme I'm going to work on, I'm going to build. And these teachings create the foundation for relationships with and among those who live on the land. So very place-based. He says that language is fundamental to one's understanding of the world or our worldview. And something that Elmer points out is how Indigenous languages that he speaks are mainly verb-based, which I understand is also the case for many Indigenous languages. I can't overgeneralize because I don't know, but I've heard this is common. So verb-based languages. And so what he conveys through words in his languages are living, animated, always in movement, dynamic and relational, and interactive across space and time and generations, the living and the material and the immaterial and spirit worlds. And he contrasts this animation or this aliveness in his indigenous tongues with English as a primarily noun-based language, which nicely lends itself to what? Reification, fixing ideas as things, fixing things in time and space so we can claim them or have ownership over them. So it's not really hard to see, based on what Elmer has shared, how language does shape our worldview and how we interact with the world. Elmer has explained how so much of the meaning and nuance of Indigenous languages is lost in translation, particularly the translation into the English language. And he'll often say this: English is from England, not from this land. So the words in English are relevant to England, not here. And he speculates that this is why English speakers have so much difficulty relating to the environment, because their words don't really translate to this land. So when we don't relate in a dynamic way, what do we do instead? We fix, we claim, we own, we accumulate, we attach rights, we dismiss, we degrade, we destroy. We do what we will with whatever the it is that we've reified when we're not attuned in a relational, interactive way and feeling responsible or accountable to that it. So when we don't speak the language of the land, I sort of think to myself, maybe we don't hear the land speak. And so now I want to shift from this little mini tutorial on diversity in language to diversity in law. And I'd like to introduce you to another person who inspires me tremendously, which is who is Anishinaabe legal scholar Dr. John Burroughs, who's a professor of Indigenous law at the University of Victoria, where I'm based. He's also an expert in constitutional law and environmental law. And just as Elmer has shared how language comes from the land and the natural world, John describes Indigenous laws as of the land. So John explains that in the British common law tradition, which has shaped the legal system of the English-speaking world, authority ultimately derives from the Crown. In contrast, Indigenous laws have authority that ultimately derives from the Creator or from nature, such as in teachings that come from animals or trees or waters and the way we interact with one another. Regarding his fluency in multiple legal systems and across multiple bodies of law, John says this. He says it's about where you look for your authority. And he has this kind of remarkable fluidity rather than a rigidness about what law even is, which maybe creates more possibilities in considering some of the kinds of sticky issues that arise in these entanglements of people, plants, and the law. And of John's many books, the one that catches my attention the most is this one called Laws, Indigenous Ethics, where he frames Anishinaabe grandmother or grandfather teachings that are listed here in numbers 1 to 7 as Anishinaabe constitutionalism, and as the very values that underlie what it means to have personal integrity in practicing the law, whether one's Anishinaabe or not, because values guide our behavior no matter who we are. Now, like Elmer, John also draws attention to how differences in verbs and noun-based languages play out in law. So here's a quote from his online interview on the profound lessons of Indigenous law. He talks about, imagining the legal implications of having a language based in verbs as opposed to nouns. Nouns are persons, places, or things, categories that you try to fix. Whereas if you've got a language as verbs, then you build a legal tradition around it. It's about what are the relationships. It's about the actions that are joined or related. And how do we inflect those relationships that verbs often have at the heart of them? Where verbs lie at the heart, there's a different kind of poetry. There's a different sense of persuasion that's in operation. So it's really a different way, a different intention in communication. The intention is not just to get to the point. The intention is to evoke a relational response. So John often speaks of law as a practice, a living practice. And he's not meaning the practice that you make your living by, although that might be true, but he's talking about how principles of law are embodied and lived through us to be in good relationship with one another in society. And this is also how I see ethics as a practice, which I'll speak about shortly. One more person I want to introduce you to who's been so inspiring and amazing is Val Napoleon. She is also a professor of Indigenous law at UVic, and she's from the Saulteaux First Nation in British Columbia. She co-founded the Indigenous Law Research Unit at UVic, which does amazing programs, taking students out into the field and enabling them to explore both colonial and Indigenous laws and legal orders. And she's co-leading a massive new addition to the law school, which is a Center for Indigenous Laws program that'll open in spring 2025. It's being built right beside where my office is, and they're building it in the traditional style of a First Nations longhouse with posts and beams of giant timbers. It's the most remarkable building you've ever seen. So they have these this living the good life Indigenous laws, as I can't read it because it's hidden by you, but you can read it. Indigenous laws is probably life or something. And there's all these values and principles that they're designing the program, building the building, and conducting themselves around. So the values are the whole basis of the program that have been collaboratively developed and agreed to support what will come through this space. And so the vision for the program is to bring together diverse legal traditions, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, be a home for both for Indigenous legal resurgence in Canada, and a place for Indigenous law as living practice, which I said already is similar to my vision of relational ethics, bringing together and drawing guidance from diverse wisdom traditions, including Indigenous knowledge and wisdom, but not limited to Indigenous knowledge and wisdom in ways that might complement legal approaches. So what I've shared so far relates to why I felt surprise and curiosity with the title of the series referring to the law, singular, in relation to people and plants, because from an ethnobiological perspective, which I would describe as the study of interrelationships between humans and the natural world, all of which underlie biocultural diversity, it would be limiting and misleading to only consider a single legal tradition, just like it would be limiting and misleading to consider English as a sufficient language to convey Indigenous knowledge and wisdom. But unfortunately, that's kind of what Western colonial worldviews and systems do, whether we're talking about science or medicine or education or law or ethics. We don't necessarily know what we don't know, and when in positions of dominance and power, we might not even be aware of how much this matters. So this is just a little generalization kind of table of ethical diversities across Western scientific traditions and Indigenous ethical traditions, and you can see right away the nouning on the left and the verbing on the right. There's a interactive, relational, multi-generational kind of interconnectedness in the Indigenous ethical realm, and there's really kind of pragmatic, linear, sequential, self-interested, rational individual going on the left there. So very, very different worldviews, very different values, and different behaviors result, different awarenesses result. I'm really interested in this. So here's my activism slide. I've been working on developing my awareness widening for years, for decades, but I actually began in the mid-1990s at what Barris calls the turn of the century. And so I purposely wore my Ethnobiology 2000 t-shirt from the Ethnobiology conference in the year 2000 at the turn of the century. And at that conference, which was in Ann Arbor, Michigan in the US, I was either a grad student or I just had finished my PhD, and I was shunted into this very controversial roundtable, facilitating a roundtable that was all about biopiracy and cultural appropriation, and so it was good fun to be kind of hucked out there. At this time in the mid-90s was the peak of biodiversity-based bioprospecting for commercializable compounds from nature, particularly medicinal plants used by Indigenous peoples. And what came to be called biopiracy by a lot of activist organizations, sometimes rightly so. I was completing a master's in microbiology in 1993 when a friend gave me um, this issue of Discover magazine. This is exactly what it looked like in 1993, fresh off the press. And he said, "Hey, you should be an ethnobotanist," because he knew I was kind of disillusioned with the microbiology. I was cloning and sequencing E. coli DNA, and it really didn't feel like I wanted to do that for much longer. But I had no idea what an ethnobotanist was. But I won't go into the details, but it turns out that I did end up getting to do a PhD in ethnobotany and plant chemistry, working with Dr. Nancy Turner in this amazing multidisciplinary partnership with Indigenous communities, the Tk'emlúps to Secwepemc communities in the interior of British Columbia. But I didn't realize at the time that I was stepping right into the frying pan, turned up on high with international claims, that the very kind of work that I was doing, not targeting me particularly, but the kind of work I was doing was might constitute biopiracy. And I was gobsmacked. I was really not sure what to do. It was so upsetting. But to keep the story very long and kind of grueling story short, I got very concerned about the potential for appropriation of Indigenous knowledge that my community partners had contributed to my research to guide which medicinal and food plants I'd be screening in the laboratory. So I pretty much literally I hung up my lab coat because I really felt such a deep responsibility to go dig into the ethical and legal realms to see, what kind of protective solutions there were for protecting the communities from this kind of appropriation that I could see was playing out in many parts of the world. I even called the legal counsel for my university to say, hey, who legally owns the data for my research? Because my laboratory supervisor said it was his, and he wanted to sell it off to small biotech companies to get extra money in the lab so they could do some screening. And I said, I think it's the Indigenous communities that I work with. And legal counsel agreed with me. So I actually had a little bit of a legal battle within my PhD. My poor supervisor ended up quitting because I think he felt offended. But he did come back eventually. We kind of reconciled and he came back. But it was kind of a big deal because this is in the mid 90s. These kind of things were kind of inconvenient and not discussed and kind of unheard of. And so I dug into whatever I could find and discovered, the whole realm of Western intellectual property rights tools. And these were just starting to be assessed back then and being found insufficient to protect Indigenous know-how. And was also a time of innovation when the late Darrell Posey, who some of you have heard of, I'm sure, foremost ethnobiologist and ethnoentomologist who worked with Dr. Graham Dutfield, and Graham spoke last year in your series about their work, but they came up with this alternative approach to the intellectual property rights system that they called traditional resource rights. So this was really inspirational to me, and I think that was the topic of Graham's talk last year in the series. So I was doing what I could to kind of figure this out, and I was publishing with a fellow grad student on using the precautionary principle and ethical principle to mitigate appropriation that might come through the public domain, through our publishing, and sort of doing all these kinds of things. And this work took me into getting in touch with Darrell and the International Society of Ethnobiology, as Barris mentioned, who were developing a code of ethics under Darrell's guidance, and it had been in play for a while, so I joined in those efforts. And sadly, Darrell passed away in 2001 before it was completed, so I took up the reins, and we did complete it in 2006 and had it adopted. It was a 1 decade long, 10-year long process to get that completed and through. It's such a controversial time. I think it is quite dated now, to be honest, but I think it was really, really good work for the times, and certainly has continues to inspire and guide people all over the world. I also want to acknowledge too how Terry Yanke's work on Indigenous cultural and intellectual property was very influential in my thinking and writing back then. as was some other ethical guidelines and policy work that was happening in Australia in those early days. So I was got very involved in the international and national research ethics policy scene, and have been involved in a lot of national ethics policy reform, which I'm still involved in today in Canada. And it's kind of exciting how serious I think that our country takes research ethics for research involving Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous peoples. So what's been really challenging and powerful and hopeful for me over the last 30 years, 30 years as a Western trained scientist who migrated into social sciences and applied ethics, is taking up the challenge and responsibility to understand in today's complex world what is relational ethics inspired by Indigenous wisdom as a living practice, like John Burroughs was talking about. And so I just really am working on that. And I'll just briefly turn to my current work in what I call biocultural ethics, which builds on my initial frying pan experiences at the turn of the century and continues to evolve today as my awareness grows and as times change, as more nuanced guidance emerges and Indigenous-led approaches continue to evolve and show up. So biocultural ethics, as I use the term, is a relational expression of applied ethics that attempts to encompass all that I've touched on so far. And I'm not really one to get stuck on definitions, so this is just a kind of a living articulation at this time, that biocultural ethics involves the ways we relate to one another, how we treat each other, how we treat all beings, not just humans, all beings in nature and the earth. There's a phrase, all my relations, all our relations. We could say the ways we treat all our relations, recognizing that we're all interconnected in the web of life, and we're relationally accountable to each other. So the basic premise is that, in ethics, is that values, or applied ethics anyways, is that values guide our behaviors and choices, and we can make conscious and intentional choices about which values and whose values or whose laws we are adopting and expressing, rather than just going with the status quo that tends to show up in most ethical codes created within Western systems and worldviews. This is, I'm not going to talk about, but here in British Columbia, where I live, the province and the country of Canada have both created national and provincial legislation to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So there's been a huge push over the last few years on many fronts, including an ethics policy, to figure out what that means and what that could mean. So I just put this up here to say that I've been, for the last few years, kind of pushing beyond just sharing abstract ideas about what biocultural ethics is, and done some recent writing in what it means to apply this kind of approach using the principle of consent, for example. We could take many different principles, but I really like that one because it shows up in both law and ethics. So there's this neat kind of convergence and possible synergy, or maybe conversation that can happen around consent between law and ethics. So I'm happy to share this paper if it's of interest. A major focus for me over the last several years has been working with a small group of colleagues in a volunteer capacity. We call ourselves an ethics advisory and stewardship circle. And all of us in our own ways have noticed a real gap in the policy landscape in Canada that hopefully will be bridged in future. But in the meantime, we wanted to come up with kind of a new articulation of ethical guidance for a particular piece of the equation, and that's the piece about sharing knowledge across different knowledge systems when there's different values and worldviews in play. And I think what I see a lot in the research process and in many processes is that people don't think about the sharing. They're way downstream. They're like, they've already shared and they're doing stuff, and then it's like, oh no, what do we do with this? Oh, how do we protect what we've created? So we went really upstream to say, what are the ways that we could share that could set us up well for downstream all the doing and the knowledge co-production processes. So we're taking a really close look at that, and this work is sort of it's just on my to-do list to finish the final edits, and then we'll be able to release it, and we're really excited about that. So if you're interested, you can just let me know. I'll give you a little glimpse about what's inside. The guidance is, I don't know, like 60 pages, but it's comprised of 9 guiding principles. And what makes this guidance different is that rather than starting with typical Western principles that you'd find in Western traditions of ethics, we started with a set of Indigenous principles that were articulated by a legally constituted group of elders and knowledge holders in Alberta called the Indigenous Wisdom Advisory Panel. And they had articulated some principles and values for themselves to work together. And we asked them, could we also use those as kind of the foundation for the ethical guidance that we were working on, and they agreed. So we started from a different place because we wanted to get to a different place, and we knew if we just stayed with the same old, we'd be reproducing the wheel in just a different way. So here's the principles, and the articulation is very intentional and kind of wordy and maybe kind of interesting. Respecting, the first one I think is just a kaboom for me. Respecting the inherent dignity, that's not new. Respecting the inherent dignity and interconnectedness, okay, of all our relations. We're not talking about human research subjects here. We're talking about everyone, everything across time and space. That doesn't come easy to somebody from who's a Western trained scientist from a Western worldview, English speaking, nouning all the time. So this takes some work. So we elaborate in the ethical guidance. What does this mean? So it's just infused with teachings that have been shared with us and that we pulled together in these ways. So you can kind of see the rest of them. And the ones in blue, consenting meaningfully and co-protecting Indigenous knowledge, they might be particularly of interest to people who are working in law. But really the nutshell of what makes this different is that we are extending this guidance beyond just humans to the more than human world, across cultures, across species, across generations, and just in this, with this intention to support us to work better together. I won't dwell on this just because of time, but just sort of some highlights of elements of consenting meaningfully. And what we did was something very intentional. I wanted to go back and say something. I'll say this first. We made sure that the guidance we were creating was consistent with existing national research ethics guidance in Canada, and we go beyond. So there's no incompatibilities. There's just, extras. I also wanted to draw your attention to the verbing thing. So you can see every one of these principles ends with ing, and that's on purpose. That's a reminder. Respect. You can just kind of go, oh yeah, respect, reification. Yeah, respect is a thing. No, the elders teach respecting is living. Is it living through you? Okay, so how is respecting flowing through you? So it's really kind of a different way to approach the idea of an ethical principle. So just to wrap up here, I want to, I've got 3 more short slides and short things to say. I just want to offer my sense that I've been in this game for 3 decades, and I've seen a lot of harm, and I've heard about even more from the past and still happening. But I actually don't think that there is any sort of villainous kind of intentions or people. I think there's really good people with really good intentions who are just not as aware as they could be. And I think that's where a lot of the harms are coming these days. So my interest in ethics is really to raise awareness and, provoke and encourage new ways of thinking and new possibilities to address both the old and emerging cross-cultural problems when we're working in the intercultural spaces. How do we do this? How do we do this in ways that we're not just reproducing the ways that haven't worked? How do we do this in new ways? And my deepest conviction at this stage of my life and in this state of the planet is that really the only way forward that has any hope is to walk together. And this is something that the elders who I get to learn from will say all the time, that there's this, we've got to do this together. We've got to find the way. It's not a question of if, it's a question of how, and we just need to figure that out. So the way forward, how to walk together, not your way or my way, but us, whoever we are, finding the way that respects and works with our diversities and pluralities as our greatest assets. Diversity is the spice of life. Variety is the spice of life. Diversity is the whole reason that life exists on this planet, if you get right down to it. So how can our diversities and pluralities be our greatest assets rather than inconveniences or threats to our power structure where we're so comfy and cozy? And this is some art by an artist statement by a local Coast Salish artist, Elliot Whitehill. I actually knew his great grandmother. She's an elder one of the first elders that I ever met, actually. So I was really delighted to see his artwork online, and I just took a screenshot for here to share with you, because I think it's really beautiful that he is kind of a younger generation person is expressing this as well. The artwork translates to be together in this interwoven landscape. And he says, as we follow the work of forming new systems from different traditions, he's writing the context of legal traditions, what does that landscape look like? It's a question. What does that landscape look like? What teachings do we carry? What are we bringing on this voyage? And how can we go about existing in this new space in a good way? This new space, not your space or my space, but a space that we co-create together. And he asks us, he invites us to honor the teachings, including laws that come from the land and from the languages. So that's the spirit that I take up my work in biocultural ethics as a way to dig into the roots of our systems, to unearth what needs to be moved aside, to make room and to seed the values that need to grow and be nurtured for us to embody and practice those values, and the behaviors that stem from those values that lead to good relations in our undeniably interconnected and very troubled world. So that's what I leave you with. I don't know if that was anything what you were expecting, but that's what came out. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And hopefully I achieved my goal of provoking a little bit of some kind of a new thought for you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And please join me in a round of virtual applause. If you have any questions, please put them into the comments section and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Thank you so much, Dr. Bannister. That was a fantastic talk. Thank you for introducing us to so many of your friends. I'm really looking forward to following up those connections, and those each sound like fascinating bodies of work. While people are cooking up their questions and putting them into the chat, I've got a couple of initial ones to start off with. So the first one is on translation and the possibility or the impossibility of translation. So it seems that you can explain many of these effects to us rather well. As soon as you talk about the difference between nouns and verbs, this clicks in my mind. I've often heard it said that everybody loves a gerund because respecting, doing, ing words have that activity to them. There's something like this about the Sapir-Whorf thesis about language and the way it structures our understanding of the world. Modern science is endlessly rediscovering the possibility of tree communication. I believe the latest news is that bird communication is on the cusp of being translated. But on the other hand, every native speaker of a reasonably obscure language will tell you that there's just this one word that has no translation, and unless you've lived that experience and grown up in that language world, it won't have the same connotations to you. So is translation possible? And on both that level of description of the phenomena and on the level of values that underlie them. Because again, it seems one could find cognates in notions of agape or Judeo-Christian love, or kind of the Rawlsian tradition asks us to be ambiguous about identity in ways which reflect a kind of similar thing. So Translation.
Yeah, great points and great question, Paris. Thank you. I think the first thing that comes back to me is we don't know what we don't know. So we can sort of make these assessments, quantitative assessments of the percent accuracy of what we're getting or not getting, but we actually don't know because, it's like fraction of a fraction. And, I really, elders like Elmer and many of the others who I work with who are fluent speakers of their own languages um, are so patient. You're so patient. And so it's not just a literal translation of the words. It's not just translating the words. There's so much more that can't possibly be conveyed, or maybe in some ways can be conveyed. You mentioned, I would say, wisdom traditions or faith traditions, agape. There's there's essences that can be transmitted, that and the essences are beyond words. And then we, as humans, language actually really kind of wrecked, from what I understand, really wrecked a lot of things for humans because we stopped having to do a whole bunch of other things once we got language. We're still suffering for them, but that's another conversation. But I think that one of the most decolonizing acts that we could do is to make the move, make the effort, make the commitment to learn the language of the land where we are. And then we would know ourselves a little bit more about what's lost in the translation or what's gained. And so I think like if we take it as an intellectual endeavor and we try to quantify and say, and maybe we're even looking for like the good enough, like what's the motive? I love your question, but what's the motive behind the question? And that's where I think we've got some unpacking to do as, Western trained scholars, where we may not even yet have glimpsed what else there is, and the what else part, that maybe the parts, the essences that are transmitted beyond words from those wisdom traditions and through the holders of those wisdom traditions. Maybe it's sort of, that's what life's all about in a way. That's the essences and the spaces that we want to be cultivating and living in. So I think I'd say run the experiment. I want to. I haven't signed up for a language course but I want to, and I feel there's a responsibility there, to find out the answer to your question. How much is lost? How much can I bridge? Yeah. So I think it's even a different reference point to even ask the question that way. Language is also, it's not just words. John and his daughter were having a conversation. John Burroughs and his daughter Lindsay were having a conversation, and she was talking about how in their Anishinaabe language, making the point or getting to the point wasn't the point. The point was for the person you were speaking with to have a sensory experience. So how much of that could be conveyed, or how much of that would be lost in translation when we're talking about a communication in a different realm? Yeah. Did I offer you anything back in response to your question that was helpful? It's such an interesting question.
That was absolutely fascinating. I completely agree with what I take to be a journey, not the destination, vision that you're painting for us. I suppose what was motivating it for me was, are we looking to translate or to create a third thing, which is a hybrid form? We've got other questions, so unless there's time to come back to that one, maybe I'll put it on pause. So we've got a question from Devdata Mukherjee. Very thought inspiring. Thank you very much. According to you, what is the extent to which biocultural ethics could enable Indigenous knowledge systems to engage with other knowledge systems that colonial legacies have distorted or obliterated?
Just have to reread it. Is does Data want to come on camera or on voice and elaborate a little bit?
I think we can unmute you if you'd
Hi,
like to come on. Ah,
Hi.
hi, am
perfect.
I audible?
You
Yes,
are,
thank you.
thank you.
Thank you very much. This was very thought inspiring. Thank you so much. And I am working on sustainability, and indigenous knowledge systems are something that I am looking into, and also into certain other knowledge systems. For example, let's say certain religious or spiritual traditions of South Asia, which have been impacted by colonial legacies, so to certain extent distorted, and some traditions obliterated. So when you talk about the relational approaches and interconnections, so do you see in any way the indigenous knowledge systems engaging with, like providing any scope of engaging with similar systems in different other parts of the world?
And are you asking in particular in relation to my sort of conception about cultural ethics or approaches that
Yes,
way?
yes. The way you envisage it, like you are talking about the interactions between different indigenous knowledge systems, and you have distilled amazing principles, how the principles are different from the Western set of principles. So, do you think that other knowledge systems which have faced similar fates due to certain kinds of impositions might be utilized to enrich what you have distilled out of the indigenous knowledge systems and inform your idea about biocultural ethics?
Yeah, I really do. Thank you for the question. And I really do. This is early work. And I see
Mhm.
another question about definitions in the next question. The reason I'm not attached to precision is because this is early work. It's still, it's still emerging, and there's a lot of diversity even across a small group that we're working in, and the reviewers that we've had involved. There's just sort of so much to consider. Um, and we sort of decided, maybe it wasn't the best idea, or maybe it was, who knows. We sort of decided to title this and sort of hone in on this indigenous and Western scientific knowledge systems. And um, that may be too narrow of a window, or it may be too precise. I don't know. But that's sort of like the pilot area for us to be elaborating this kind of and articulating this emerging kind of approach, and I would say body of applied ethics, relational ethics, um, that hasn't really been well articulated. There is somebody else working in the area, Ricardo Rossi. We sort of approach similarly, but not the same in terms of a definition or a description. But my personal hope, I guess, and inspiration is that what we're offering, some of it is particular to Canadian and to Indigenous peoples and communities in Canada. Some of it is particular because we're aiming for a national kind of impact. But if we strip away some of those particularities, my particular interest is what can what can we articulate that comes from a diversity of wisdom traditions, maybe faith traditions, maybe but those spaces of wisdom um, that are beyond the words, I guess, in a way, and um, I think time will tell, but I think my answer to your question is yes. I think there's possibilities there, and that's my hope. In this process of sort of sharing something out that's kind of on the emergent and new side, there's all sorts of things that, state of readiness to get it ready to share, and then you're going to get the feedback and the positive and the flack and all the rest, and then what do you do with it? But my hope is over time that we can kind of do as actually the Indigenous Wisdom Advisory Panel elders told us. They said, okay, all really good stuff. Now get it down to 2 pages.
Mm.
And they just said, cut to the chase and get to the essence. And there's such beauty in that, right? There's such depth of wisdom. And yet, when you are not coming from that wisdom tradition or trained in that way or attuned, if we make it too short and sweet, it'll just become a yep, 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 I'm respectful, yep, 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 yep. And that's, I think, a phenomenon that goes on in our Western institutions, especially when it comes to Western research ethics as it's implemented institutionally, which kind of breaks my heart because there's such an opportunity to kind of engage and learn and deepen and, raise your awareness and, be humbled. It's humbling work. And it's developmental work, right? It's developmental work. It's not intellectual work ultimately. We're talking about, possibilities that can support you in your character development so that, you might just be a better person or, or, yeah. So yeah, I train in Zen, and it's another wisdom tradition that I think has a lot to offer to this. So, I'd love the East meets West kind of encounter,
Mhm.
which I think is more kind of along the lines that you're talking. And we're kind of at the early stages of this, but I hope the potential is there. I hope so. And honestly, if you're interested and you see the potential, let's see where you can take it. I think this is the work is to be offered out and then for others to take it up and see where it's useful, see where it needs to be adjusted, and it could be elaborated or it could be condensed down to love, love and kindness. So yeah, those are my thoughts. I don't know if that's helpful, but thank you for your
Oh, yes,
question.
it is. It is. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for coming on camera. Good to see you.
Much for the question. So I think we've touched on the definitional question that came up, although Andrew, if you would like to follow up, perhaps that will be something to do after the session. There's one more question slated, which is it's a complicated one. Do you want to engage with that now, Dr. Bannister, or do you want to take that up in
I
correspondence
sort of
later,
don't want to
maybe?
dismiss Andrew's question because I think, it's really
Okay.
good and, good points, Andrew. And I don't know if you want to come and speak a little bit about this. And, certainly didn't mean to, I didn't mean to be flippant or trivial. Ask for your grace and in whatever it is that I said, whatever came out. But I think in what I'm reading your question, yeah, I think these are really, really important elements. So I don't know if you want to speak to it a little bit or, um,
Yeah, sure. If it, I hope everyone can hear me all right. Um,
hi.
well, hello. Thank you so much, Dr. Bannister. Yeah. So my question concerns the nature in which rights and title are currently allocated in Canada, which is through Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982, as I'm sure you know. And the subsequent law has really developed that allocation of rights and title through this notion of culture. And one of the things that I think about a lot and worry about in the development of ethics is these efforts to be, well, I guess it's something like almost like trying to be trying to develop a perfect ethics without realizing the concrete grounds of current relations between Indigenous nations and the Canadian government. And these efforts often really hinge on really concrete definitions about really crucial terms, like things like culture. And so I wonder about your thoughts about these kinds of terms, things like culture, things like maybe even liberty or title, which don't have a straightforward interpretation in a lot of Indigenous ontologies, or at least they're not straightforwardly translatable. And how you develop an ethics that's sensitive both to current circumstances, which have to deal with the Canadian state, but then also future circumstances where we would like to ideally move beyond these kinds of definitions to a more equitable, and as you say, these kinds of relational concerns where we're dealing with engaging with Indigenous nations on a nation-to-nation set of terms and on an equitable basis.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So I think what I said was that not that I didn't care about definitions, but I wasn't stuck on definitions. And I think it kind of feels similar a little bit to what you're saying. Like it's not that definitions and precision isn't important. It's just that that's not what I'm particularly focusing on in this emergent body of work. And I would say that I think that as much as there is, as you've very amply outlined, really important reasons for the precision and definitions and clarity, we can get stuck there. I think about the term traditional knowledge, which for decades was a sticking point. and it's not that that's not important to figure out, but there's also important work that needs to continue as well. So it's not a either or, but there's an and I think that we may need to choose where we place ourselves in these multiple important conversations. Right now, I'm not on the ground where you're talking about, but where I can tell you that I am working in this ethics work is having life is I'm been working, one of the people as part of our ethics circle working on this these ethical guidelines is an elder, a Pagani Blackfoot elder named Ira Provost. And his community wants to create what they're calling a biocultural community protocol. Maybe we don't all love the term, or maybe we do love it. But again, these are sort of these things, right? They're tools, and we can kind of get, we can spend a lot of time deciding what we're going to call them, or we could try to bring them to life and use them. And we have to decide what's important to us. And there's no right or wrong there. We just have to make the call about where to put our energy and effort when something needs to move along. So we're going to use our ethics work to develop what we're calling a Pagani biocultural protocol. And Ira sees the need for that document to be a bridging document between his nation and government and development and in industry, because the pressures are tremendous. So this is kind of like it's related but different space, a different kind of tool that will relate with the kinds of the kinds of precisions on the ground that you're talking about in the sort of the legal context and the nation to nation kind of context. So yeah, I guess, Andrew, I would say, yeah, I agree that these are really important and not to be dismissed. And I certainly apologize if it sounded like I was trivializing definitions or clarity. But yeah, I think we have to figure out the spaces that we can make our contribution to, and then just go for it in those spaces, and then have these conversations, bridge across those spaces, so that we're not help each other, so that we're not misunderstanding or misconstruing or creating confusion in another space that's actually relying on your relational ethics work because it's going to be useful, but you kind of went sideways there. So I'm really interested in how do we kind of bridge and connect across these spaces so that we can be supportive of all the work that needs to be done in these different realms. Yeah. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you so much. We've got one question left. How are you doing for time?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, fine. Let me see if I can.
It's the one from Kate Judith, and I think Kate is still with us.
Okay, Kate, do you want to elaborate on your question, or yeah, please.
I
Thank you for
think,
coming on camera.
thank you. Hopefully I've stated it there adequately. I think I'm just interested to see how the work that you're doing can incorporate the idea that it's not only humans that are doing this struggling to create cultures and that can continue on with others, that plants, animals, fungi, ecosystems are all busy trying to figure out their forms of meaningfulness to continue on into the future with us, as you know, among us. So, so I'm just wondering how your work can sort of in interfaces with that sort of way of thinking.
Yeah, I think so. In sharing out kind of like a super fast snapshot, you didn't really kind of get to see read between the lines or see any of the details. So I guess I'd be interested to see what you found in the work if you read the body of work itself. This so I'm going to also distinguish between biocultural ethics as a kind of a realm that I've been calling my work and working within, and this particular ethical guidance that we're kind of rolling out, which kind of is like a smaller, more focused area. And I think if you're asking the biocultural ethics realm, yeah, I think that is my hope to yeah, how would we say? Well, I have a colleague, Sarap, is on joining from New Zealand. He's traveling. Rivers. What do rivers have to say? I think that will probably be one of the first beings that we'll be inviting conversation with, because Sarap is in New Zealand, meeting one of the rivers, who has personhood there. So yeah, I look forward to it. I think we have a lot of work to do in opening up to how do we communicate beyond our human ways of communication. I'm really pretty trained as a human. So I've got a lot of work to do. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the question. Beautiful question.
Thank you.
Are we good?
Okay, I think so. Very good. Thank you so much for staying back and dealing amazingly with a really fantastic set of questions that I thought gave a wonderful chance to elaborate some more on the talk. Thank you so much for your time. It's been fantastic, and you promised it was going to be a spicy talk, and it definitely has been. I think you can see from the engagement and the thanks coming in now through the comments that it's really touched a note. And I think the remaining people could join me in a virtual round of applause.
Oh, and thank you so much, Barris. It's been really lovely to meet you and to be in communication with you about the series. And I look forward to the rest of the speakers. I know that they're really amazing people. So thank you. Thank you for organizing.
Likewise. Well, I mean, you've done the important and fantastic job of opening up the series for us, and in such style. It's been really fantastic. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Barris. Okay, thank you, everybody.